I buried my partner with my own hands in the canyon, where we swore to strike it rich. Then I found the map he'd hidden, a fortune in gold waiting in the mountains. But when I reached the claim, 12 graves surrounded the mine entrance, and a woman emerged from the darkness holding a shotgun. Some gold, I learned too late, demands a price steeper than your soul. These lands know pain better than joy, merciless. Every mark in the sand tells a story, hurt to look at, but folks rarely listen. Kind of blue that made a man feel with my own eyes, the vastness, like the crackle of fire on his shoulders. The shadows of Mercer knelt in the red dust beside a shallow grave. Close. His hands raw and the only way to survive, scraping at the unyielding earth with nothing but a rusted shovel and his own failing strength. The body wrapped in canvas before him had once been Thomas Brennan, his partner, his friend, the man who'd sworn over whiskey and campfire smoke that they'd find their fortune together or die trying. Turned out Thomas had found both. 3 days ago, they'd been riding through this godforsaken stretch of Arizona territory, following rumors of a silver claim abandoned 20 years back when the Apache Wars had driven every prospector screaming back to civilization. Thomas had been the believer, the one with fire at his eyes every time he unfolded that grease-stained map he'd won in a poker game from a dying prospector in Tucson. Jacob had been the skeptic, the one who'd seen too many men chase fool's gold into early graves. Now here he was, burying Thomas in the same canyon that was supposed to make them rich. The ambush had come without warning. Masked riders, maybe 6 of them, appearing like ghosts from behind the canyon walls just as the sun was setting. They'd fired first and asked questions never. Thomas took 2 bullets to the chest before he could even draw his weapon. Jacob had managed to return fire, dropping one of the bastards before his horse bolted, carrying him 3 miles down the canyon before he could regain control. By the time he'd circled back under cover of darkness, the riders were gone. Thomas was cooling in the dust, and their supplies had been ransacked. But they'd missed something. Jacob patted the weathered map now tucked inside his shirt, pressed against his heart like a promise he couldn't break. Thomas had hidden it well, sewn into the lining of his saddle where desperate thieves wouldn't think to look. Jacob had found it by accident while searching for anything salvageable, and when he'd unfolded it by moonlight, his hands had trembled with something between grief and greed. The map showed a route to the Copper Mountains to a place marked only with an X and the words Widow's Fortune scrawled in faded ink. Coordinates, landmarks, and a note at the bottom that made Jacob's blood run cold. 12 died for this. Don't be 13. He'd ignored the warning. Men always did. Now, as he shoveled the last of the red earth over Thomas's grave, Jacob spoke to the mound of dirt as if his partner could still hear him. I'm finishing this, Tom. Whatever's up there, whatever you died for, I'm claiming it. For both of us. His voice cracked on the last words, the desert wind carrying them away into the vast emptiness that swallowed everything out here. Hope, dreams, screams. The canyon walls rose steep and jagged around him, their stratified layers of red and orange rock testament to eons of patient erosion. Vultures circled high above, black specks against that merciless blue, waiting with the patience of creatures who knew that death came to everything eventually in this land. Jacob could feel their eyes on him, hungry and knowing. He fashioned a crude cross from 2 pieces of dried mesquite wood, lashing them together with leather cord from his saddle. He drove it into the soft earth at the head of the grave, then stood back, his hat clutched to his chest in a gesture that felt hollow but necessary. Thomas had been Catholic, Jacob thought, or maybe Methodist. They'd never talked much about God. Out here, most men figured God had forgotten about them anyway. Ashes to ashes, Jacob muttered, then stopped, unable to remember the rest of the words. He put his hat back on, turned toward his horse, and didn't look back. Looking back was for men who had something left to lose. The ride toward the Copper Mountains took 2 days of hard traveling through terrain that fought him every mile. The desert gave way to rocky foothills bristling with prickly pear and cholla cactus, their spines waiting to punish any careless step. The sun beat down relentlessly during the day, and at night the temperature plummeted until Jacob's breath came in visible clouds and his bedroll felt thin as paper against the cold seeping up from the earth. He followed the map's landmarks, a distinctive rock formation that looked like a crouching cougar, a dry creek bed that zigzagged northwest, a stand of ancient Joshua trees twisted into shapes that seemed almost human. Each landmark checked off brought him closer to the X, closer to whatever fortune Thomas had died protecting. On the evening of the second day, as the sun bled crimson across the western horizon, Jacob crested a ridge and saw it. A narrow valley tucked between two mountain peaks, its entrance almost hidden by a rock slide that looked decades old. According to the map, Widow's fortune lay somewhere in that valley, concealed from casual eyes, but waiting for those determined or desperate enough to find it. Jacob made camp on the ridge, not wanting to descend into the valley in darkness. He built a small fire, just enough to boil coffee and warm his hands, and studied the map one more time by firelight. The detail was extraordinary, every twist of the valley, every outcropping marked with precision. Whoever had drawn this had known the territory intimately, had walked every foot of it, had probably died for that knowledge. That warning at the bottom kept drawing his eye. 12 died for this. Don't be 13. Jacob told himself he didn't believe in curses. He told himself that men died in the West for 1,000 reasons. Indians, outlaws, accidents, disease, plain bad luck. 12 dead men didn't mean the gold was cursed. It just meant 12 men had been careless or greedy, or in the wrong place when violence came calling. But as he lay in his bedroll that night, staring up at stars so bright and numerous they seemed to press down on him, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the darkness beyond his fire's reach. The wind moving through the rocks sounded almost like whispers, like voices warning him to turn back while he still could. He didn't turn back. Men like Jacob Mercer never did. Dawn came cold and gray, the sun struggling to burn through a haze that clung to the mountain peaks like smoke from a distant fire. Jacob broke camp quickly, his hands stiff from the night's cold, and began his descent into the valley. The rock slide that partially blocked the entrance looked old but unstable. Great slabs of granite balanced precariously against each other, ready to come crashing down with the slightest disturbance. He dismounted and led his horse carefully through the narrow gap, his boots crunching on loose scree that shifted treacherously underfoot. The sound echoed off the valley walls, amplified into something that sounded like approaching footsteps. Jacob's hand drifted to his revolver more than once before he forced himself to relax. Nerves would get him killed faster than any ambush. The valley opened up beyond the rock slide into a space, perhaps 200 yards wide and half a mile long, its floor covered in sage and creosote bush. At the far end, barely visible through the morning haze, Jacob could make out the dark mouth of what had to be the mine entrance, a black wound in the mountainside framed by timber supports weathered gray with age. He was halfway across the valley floor when he saw them. Graves, 12 of them, arranged in 2 neat rows of 6, their markers simple wooden crosses, weathered to the color of bone. They stood between Jacob and the mine entrance like silent sentinels, like a barrier that couldn't be crossed without acknowledgement. Jacob's horse whinnied nervously, pulling back on the reins. He had to fight to get the animal moving again, and even then it stepped sideways, ears flat against its head, nostrils flaring at some scent Jacob couldn't detect. Every instinct told him to mount up and ride hard away from this place. But greed, or maybe it was determination, or loyalty to Thomas's memory, kept his feet moving forward. The graves were old, some of them obviously decades in the making based on how far the crosses had tilted and how much the mounds had settled. But others looked newer, the earth still relatively fresh, the crosses still standing straight. Jacob counted them again to be sure. 12 graves, exactly as the map had warned. Most had no names carved into their markers, but 3 did. Samuel Worth, 1867. Antonio Reyes, 1872. And closest to the mine entrance, Catherine Brennan, 1885. The last name made Jacob freeze. Brennan, the same last name as Thomas. Coincidence? Or had Thomas known more about this place than he'd ever shared? You looking for the gold, Or are you looking for your grave? The voice came from behind him, calm and cold as winter steel. Jacob spun, his hand flying to his revolver, but froze when he saw her. A woman stood 20 feet away, having materialized from the rocks like a ghost. Or maybe she'd been there all along, and he'd been too focused on the graves to notice. She held a double-barreled shotgun leveled at his chest, and from the steady way she aimed it, Jacob knew she wouldn't hesitate to pull the triggers. She was somewhere in her 40s, her face weathered by sun and hardship, but still handsome in a severe way. Her dark hair was pulled back in a bun, streaked with gray. She wore men's clothing, canvas trousers, a leather vest over a faded shirt, boots that had walked 1,000 miles. But it was her eyes that held Jacob frozen, eyes that had seen death and dealt it, eyes that measured him and found him wanting. "I'm not looking for trouble," Jacob said slowly, keeping his hand away from his weapon, "just following a map to a claim." "That map belonged to Thomas Brennan," the woman said. "It wasn't a question, which means either you killed him for it, or he's dead and you're fool enough to follow his path." "Thomas was my partner," Jacob replied, his voice tight. "He was killed 3 days ago in an ambush. I buried him myself." Something flickered across the woman's face. Grief, maybe, or just confirmation of something she'd already known. The shotgun didn't waver. "Thomas was my brother," she said flatly, "and I warned him not to come back here. I warned him this place takes more than it gives." Jacob felt the pieces clicking into place. Catherine Brennan, the name on the newest grave. But this woman was very much alive. "You're Catherine Brennan," she interrupted. "And that grave you're staring at belongs to my daughter, Catherine. She was 16 when this place killed her. So you'll forgive me if I'm not inclined to let another greedy fool walk into that mine and add another cross to this valley." The wind picked up, whistling through the valley with a sound like distant screaming. Jacob's horse pulled harder at the reins, wanting to bolt. He couldn't blame it. Everything about this place felt wrong. The graves, the woman with a shotgun, the mine entrance gaping like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. "The map shows there's silver here," Jacob said, trying to keep his voice reasonable. "Enough to make a man rich." Thomas believed it. He died believing it. "Oh, there's silver," Catherine agreed, her voice bitter. "More silver than you could spend in 10 lifetimes, if the stories are true. My husband found it 20 years ago. We were going to be rich, build a proper house in San Francisco, send Catherine to a fancy school back east. All the dreams that brought people west." She gestured toward the graves with the shotgun's barrel. "But the silver doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the mountain, and the mountain takes payment in blood. My husband was the first to die, crushed when a tunnel collapsed. Then his partners started dying. Accidents, they called them at first. A cave in here, a man falling down a shaft there. But after the 6th death, even the desperate ones started to realize something was wrong." 12 deaths, Jacob said, looking at the graves again. The map warned about 12 deaths. 12 so far, Catherine corrected. "The last was my daughter, just 8 months ago. She came here against my orders, thinking she could succeed where her father failed. The mountain swallowed her, just like it swallowed all the others. Found her body at the bottom of the main shaft, neck broken, eyes wide open like she'd seen something terrifying in her last moments." Jacob wanted to dismiss her words as superstition, the ramblings of a woman broken by grief. But standing in this valley, surrounded by 12 graves, feeling the weight of those mountains pressing down, hearing that wind that sounded too much like voices, he couldn't quite manage it. "If it's so dangerous, why are you still here?" he asked. Catherine's laugh was harsh, without humor. "Because someone has to keep fools like you from becoming number 13. Because this is where my family is buried, and I won't abandon them. And because maybe, just maybe, I'm waiting for someone smart enough to break the curse instead of feeding it." "You think there's really a curse?" "I think there's something in that mountain that doesn't want to be disturbed," Catherine replied. "Whether you call it a curse, or bad luck, or just the earth taking revenge for human greed, the result's the same. Men go into that mine, and they don't come out. At least, not alive. The standoff stretched between them. The shotgun still aimed steady at Jacob's chest. He should ride away, he knew. Thomas was already dead. Nothing would bring him back. The smart move was to count his losses and find another path to fortune. But Jacob had never been smart about knowing when to quit. "I made a promise," he said quietly, "to finish what Thomas started. I'm going into that mine, with or without your permission." Catherine studied him for a long moment, her finger resting on the shotgun's triggers. Then, surprisingly, she lowered the weapon. "You've got the look of a man who's already made peace with dying," she said. "I've seen it enough times to recognize it. Fine, go ahead. But when you're lying at the bottom of a shaft with your back broken, don't say you weren't warned." She stepped aside, clearing the path to the mine entrance. Jacob led his horse past her, acutely aware of the shotgun that could still end him with a simple trigger pull. But Catherine just watched him go, her expression unreadable. As he approached the mine entrance, Jacob paused at Catherine Brennan's grave. He took off his hat in a gesture of respect, then looked back at Catherine. "If there's a way to break this curse," he called out, "maybe we can break it together." Catherine didn't answer. She simply turned and walked back toward the rocks where she'd emerged, disappearing into the shadows like she'd never been there at all. Jacob tied his horse to one of the timber supports and stared into the darkness of the mine entrance. Somewhere in there lay either his fortune or his grave. Taking a deep breath, he lit the lantern he'd brought, checked his revolver, and stepped into the mountain's mouth. The darkness swallowed him whole. The mine tunnel stretched before Jacob like the throat of some ancient beast, the walls rough-hewn and dripping with moisture that gleamed in his lantern light like sweat. The air was cool and heavy, pressing against his lungs with each breath, carrying the mineral smell of stone and something else, something old and rotting that made his stomach clench. His boots echoed on the wooden planks that formed a crude walkway over the rocky floor, each step sending whispers running ahead of him into the darkness. Every few yards he passed timber supports that held back the weight of the mountain, many of them cracked or sagging under pressure that had been building for decades. This place was a death trap waiting to spring. About 50 yards in, the main tunnel branched into 3 passages. Jacob consulted the map by lantern light, finding markings that indicated the right-hand passage led to the main silver vein. He marked his path with chalk on the wall, an old prospector's trick Thomas had taught him, and took the right fork. The passage narrowed, forcing him to duck beneath low-hanging rocks and turn sideways in places where the walls pressed close. His breathing grew labored, not from exertion, but from the sensation that the mountain was closing around him, that tons of stone above could come crashing down at any moment and entomb him in darkness eternal. Then the passage opened into a larger chamber, and Jacob stopped, his lantern raised high. What he saw took his breath away. The walls of the chamber glittered with silver ore, veins of it thick as a man's arm running through the rock like frozen lightning. There was enough wealth here to buy a small city, enough to make Jacob Mercer one of the richest men in the territory. But it was the other thing in the chamber that made his blood run cold. Bones, human bones, scattered across the chamber floor like discarded toys. Skulls grinning up at him from the shadows. Rib cages crushed and broken. A severed hand still wearing a wedding ring. Jacob counted remains from at least 4 different people, maybe more. It was hard to tell with the skeletons so jumbled and incomplete. These weren't ancient bones. The clothing scraps still clinging to them were relatively modern, denim, cotton leather. These were the prospectors who'd come before him, the men and women whose graves stood outside in neat rows. They'd made it this far, found the silver they sought, and died for it. Jacob's hand found his revolver, though he didn't know what he was expecting to shoot. The dead were already dead, but the sense of being watched, of being in the presence of something hostile and aware, made him desperate for the comfort of cold steel. A sound echoed through the chamber, a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, felt as much as heard. The lantern flickered, its flame bending sideways as if pushed by breath, though the air in the chamber was perfectly still. Then he saw it, Carved into the far wall above the richest vein of silver, nearly hidden by shadows, was a symbol. Jacob stepped closer, raising his lantern, and felt his mouth go dry. It was Apache. He recognized the style from his years in the territory. A thunderbird with spread wings, and beneath it, figures that could have been men or spirits, surrounded by flames. "It's a warning." Catherine's voice came from behind him, nearly making Jacob drop his lantern. He spun to find her standing at the chamber entrance, her shotgun cradled in her arms. Or maybe a curse. The Apache who used to live in these mountains considered this place sacred. When my husband discovered the silver, he didn't care. Greed makes men blind to everything but gold and silver. "You followed me," Jacob said, his heart still hammering from a surprise. "I couldn't let you die alone," Catherine replied, stepping into the chamber. She seemed unsurprised by the bones, stepping around them with the ease of someone who'd seen them before. "Besides, maybe you're the one who can finally break this. The one who'll listen to reason instead of greed. There's enough silver here to make us both rich," Jacob said, gesturing to the glittering walls. "We could work together, extract it carefully, respect whatever spirits guard this place." "The spirits don't want respect," Catherine interrupted. "They want the silver left alone. Every person who's tried to take it has died, Jacob. Every single one. My husband, his partners, the scavengers who came after, my daughter." Her voice broke on the last word. Another rumble shook the chamber, louder this time. Dust and small stones rained down from the ceiling. The timber supports creaked ominously. Jacob looked up, seeing cracks spreading across the stone overhead like spider webs. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently. "This whole place is about to come down." "It always does," Catherine replied calmly. "Right about now, when someone reaches the silver and starts thinking about how to extract it, that's when the mountain takes payment." "Then why aren't you running?" Jacob demanded. Catherine's smile was sad and strange. "Because I've run 12 times before, watching others die while I survived. I'm tired of running, Jacob. Tired of watching this place kill everyone I care about while I stand helpless. Maybe it's time I paid my own debt." A massive crack split the air like thunder. A section of the ceiling collapsed, tons of rock crashing down exactly where Jacob had been standing moments before. He dove sideways, hitting the chamber floor hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. His lantern skidded away, its flame guttering dangerously. Through the dust and chaos, he saw Catherine standing motionless in the center of the chamber, her face turned upward toward the fracturing ceiling, her expression almost peaceful. She'd made her choice. She was going to let the mountain take her, let herself become the 13th grave. "No," Jacob shouted. He launched himself across the chamber, wrapped his arms around Catherine's waist, and dragged her toward the passage entrance as the entire chamber began to implode behind them. Rock rained down like judgment, filling the space where they'd been standing, burying the silver and the bones in tons of stone. They tumbled into the narrow passage together, rolling and scrambling as the collapse chased them. Jacob grabbed his lantern, miraculously still burning, and pulled Catherine to her feet. They ran through the darkness, the mountain roaring behind them, death reaching out with hands made of stone. The main tunnel was ahead, then daylight, blessed, beautiful daylight. They burst from the mine entrance and kept running, not stopping until they'd cleared the valley floor and reached the rockslide entrance. Only then did they turn to watch as the mine shaft collapsed completely, the timber supports splintering like matchsticks, the mountain swallowing its secrets once and for all. In the settling dust, Jacob and Catherine stood side by side, both of them gasping for breath, both alive when all logic said they should be dead. "The 13th didn't die," Catherine said wonderingly. The pattern broke. Jacob looked at the 12 graves, then at the rubble that now sealed the mine. "Maybe that's because for once, someone chose life over silver," he said quietly. They made camp that night at the valley entrance, neither willing to leave until they'd processed what had happened. The mountain loomed above them, silent now, the mine entrance completely sealed by the collapse. Whatever silver remained in there would stay buried forever, a fortune that would never be claimed. Catherine sat by the fire Jacob had built, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring into the flames with eyes that had seen too much death. She'd barely spoken since they'd escaped the mine, processing the fact that she'd nearly let herself become the 13th victim of this cursed place. "Why did you save me?" she asked finally, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "You could have left me there. The mountain would have claimed me, and you could have told yourself the curse was broken, that you'd fulfilled your debt to Thomas." Jacob poured himself more coffee, taking his time with the answer. "Because Thomas wouldn't have wanted that," he said. "My partner died chasing silver, but he wasn't a cruel man. He wouldn't have wanted me to let his sister die just to break some curse." "Half-sister," Catherine corrected automatically, then shook her head. "Thomas and I shared a father, but not a mother. Different worlds, different lives, until the prospect of silver brought us both to this cursed valley. He sent me letters, you know. Told me about you, about your partnership. Said you were the cautious one, the one who might actually survive the West, because you thought before you acted." Jacob gave a bitter laugh. "And yet here I am, having nearly died chasing the same silver that killed him." "But you didn't die," Catherine pointed out. "Neither of us did. That has to mean something." They fell silent, watching sparks from the fire spiral up toward the stars. The night was clear and cold, the kind of night that made you feel small against the vastness of the universe. "What will you do now?" Jacob asked eventually. "Stay here, guarding graves?" Catherine shook her head slowly. "I don't think I can anymore. Catherine, my daughter, she wouldn't want me to waste my life standing watch over her bones. She'd want me to live, to find something worth living for beyond grief and guilt." "Then come with me," Jacob said impulsively. "We may not have struck it rich, but we're alive. That's worth more than silver." Catherine looked at him sharply. "Come where?" "Anywhere but here," Jacob replied. "There are other opportunities in the territory. Silver mines that aren't cursed. Cattle ranches, settlements that need people willing to work hard and start over. We both know what it's like to lose everything. Maybe that means we're the ones who can appreciate building something new." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the firelight. Then she said, "You know what my daughter told me before she died? She said she didn't want the silver. She wanted adventure, wanted to see if she could succeed where others failed. Not for the wealth, but for the challenge. I called her foolish, told her she'd die for nothing." "She was brave," Jacob said quietly. "Foolish maybe, but brave. That takes courage most people never find." "And I let fear make me bitter," Catherine continued. "After she died, I convinced myself that staying here, warning others away, was some kind of noble purpose. But really, I was just too afraid to leave, too afraid to face a world without the family I'd lost." She stood, walking to the edge of their camp, where she could see the 12 graves silhouetted in the moonlight. Jacob followed, giving her space, but staying close enough to offer support if needed. "I should bury them properly," Catherine said. "Real markers with their names. The ones I know, anyway. They deserve that much. We'll do it together," Jacob offered. "In the morning." Catherine turned to him, and for the first time since they'd met, she smiled, a small, tentative expression, but genuine. "You're a good man, Jacob Mercer. Thomas chose his partner well." They spent the next day carving proper markers for the graves, working side by side in the desert sun. Catherine knew most of the names, men and women who'd come to the valley seeking fortune and found only death. Samuel Worth, Antonio Reyes, Catherine Brennan, and others whose names were lost to time, marked only with the year they died. For Thomas, Jacob carved a marker to match the others, even though his partner lay buried 3 days right away. It felt right to honor him here, in the place that had claimed so many others' dreams. When the work was done and the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley, Catherine and Jacob stood before the graves one last time. Catherine spoke a prayer, words Jacob didn't recognize, but that sounded ancient and meaningful. Then she placed her hand on Catherine's marker, whispered something private, and turned away. "I'm ready," she said simply. "Let's leave this place behind." They rode out of the valley together as the last light faded from the sky, leaving the graves and the sealed mine and the cursed silver to the mountain that claimed them. Neither looked back. The trail from Copper Mountain took them northeast toward the New Mexico territory, through high desert country where the air was thin and clean, where thunderstorms built on the horizon every afternoon and painted the sky with colors that had no names. Jacob and Catherine rode in comfortable silence most days, both processing what they'd survived, both wondering what came next. They stopped in a town called Socorro on the fourth day, a rough mining settlement that clung to the foothills like a barnacle on a ship's hull. The town was alive with the energy of men who still believed in striking it rich, who hadn't yet learned the hard lessons about greed and death that Jacob and Catherine carried like scars. In the town's only respectable hotel, over a meal that wasn't hardtack and coffee, Catherine told Jacob about her life before the mine. She'd been a schoolteacher in Missouri, married young to a dreamer named William Brennan, who dragged her west chasing prospects and promises. They'd had Catherine late in life, a daughter who'd inherited her father's restlessness and her mother's intelligence, a dangerous combination. William found the widow's fortune claim by accident, Catherine explained, pushing beans around her plate. He'd been prospecting for months with no luck, running through our savings, getting more desperate. Then one day he came back to camp with silver ore in his hands and madness in his eyes. Said he'd found enough to make us rich 10 times over. But he never got to spend it, Jacob said. Died in the first collapse, 6 weeks after filing his claim. After that, I tried to work the mine myself, hired men to help. That's when the deaths started, one by one. Anyone who went into that mountain either came out screaming about spirits and thunder, or didn't come out at all. She took a sip of whiskey, grimacing at the burn. I should have abandoned it then. Should have taken Catherine and left. But I was stubborn, convinced I could make William's dream pay off. Instead, I spent 20 years watching that place kill everyone who came near it, including my daughter. "You're not there anymore," Jacob reminded her gently. "That's what matters." "Is it?" Catherine looked at him with eyes that carried decades of guilt. "How many of those 12 graves are my fault, Jacob? How many people did I encourage to try the mine, thinking maybe this time it would be different?" "None of them," Jacob said firmly. "Every person who went into that mine made their own choice. You didn't force them. You didn't promise them safety. The West is full of dangers, and men and women who come here know the risks." "Pretty words," Catherine said, but some of the tension left her shoulders. Thomas used to say things like that. He had a way of making hard truths sound bearable. They left Socorro the next morning and continued northeast. Catherine had suggested they try the settlement of Cimarron, where she'd heard a new school was being established and teachers were needed. Jacob had agreed, though he had no idea what he'd do with himself in a settled town. He'd spent his adult life chasing prospects, living rough, moving from camp to camp. The idea of putting down roots felt foreign. But as they rode, something began to shift in him. Maybe it was the steady rhythm of travel without desperation driving it. Maybe it was the company of someone who understood loss without demanding he explain it. Or maybe it was simply that for the first time in years, Jacob wasn't running toward something. He was walking beside someone, and that made all the difference. They were 2 days from Cimarron when they encountered the problem. A stagecoach, overturned on the side of the trail, its team of horses scattered. 2 bodies lay in the dirt nearby, both shot, both stripped of valuables. Bandits had hit the coach, probably that morning based on how fresh the blood looked. Jacob and Catherine approached cautiously, weapons drawn, but the bandits were long gone, and the dead men, the driver and a guard, were beyond help. What concerned Jacob more was the sound coming from inside the overturned coach, a child crying. They found her trapped beneath luggage and overturned seats. A girl maybe 8 years old with brown curls and a blood-stained dress. Her leg was twisted at an angle that made Jacob's stomach churn, clearly broken. But she was alive, and when Catherine spoke to her in a gentle voice, the girl latched onto her with desperate hands. My name's Sarah, the girl sobbed. Those men shot Mr. Henderson and took Mama. They said they'd come back for me after they sold her to someone in Santa Fe. Jacob and Catherine exchanged a dark look. They both knew what happened to women sold in Santa Fe's shadier establishments. The girl's mother had maybe days before she disappeared into a life that would break her. How many men? Jacob asked, keeping his voice calm despite the fury building in his chest. 5, Sarah whimpered. 5 men on horses heading that way. She pointed northeast, the same direction Jacob and Catherine had been traveling. Catherine was already examining Sarah's leg, her experienced hands gentle but thorough. Clean break, she announced. Painful but treatable. We need to splint it, then get her to a doctor. The nearest doctor is in Cimarron, Jacob said. 2 days' ride. Then we ride, Catherine replied, already tearing fabric from her skirt to make bandages. But first we get her mother back, Jacob finished. He checked his revolver, making sure all 6 chambers were loaded. He'd been avoiding violence since Thomas died, telling himself he was done with that part of frontier life. But some things couldn't be walked away from. Some wrongs demanded correction, even if it meant blood. Catherine caught his arm. You can't take on 5 armed men alone. I won't be alone, Jacob replied, nodding toward her shotgun. I'm assuming you know how to use that thing. Catherine's smile was grim. My husband taught me. Said a woman in the West needed to know how to defend herself. It's the most useful thing he ever gave me. They splinted Sarah's leg as carefully as they could, then fashioned a travois from branches and blankets to drag behind Catherine's horse. Sarah would travel slowly but safely back toward Socorro, where they'd passed through, with directions to find the doctor there. It meant the girl would be alone for part of the journey, but she was brave and determined to help save her mother. You ride straight through, Jacob instructed. Don't stop for anyone except lawmen. If you see other travelers, hide until they pass. Understand? Sarah nodded, clutching the reins of Catherine's gentler mare. Please save my mama, she whispered. We will, Catherine promised, a promise that carried the weight of all her own failures with it. I swear it. They watched Sarah ride south, back toward Socorro and safety, before turning their own horses northeast, toward Cimarron, toward 5 armed bandits, toward a reckoning that had been building since Jacob buried Thomas in that canyon. The West had taught Jacob Mercer that some debts could only be paid in blood. Today he was collecting. They tracked the bandits for a day and a half, following sign that grew fresher with each mile. The outlaws weren't being careful. Why should they be? They'd murdered 2 men, kidnapped a woman, and left a child for dead. Out here, beyond the reach of any organized law, they probably thought themselves untouchable. Jacob and Catherine found their camp just after sunset on the 2nd day, tucked into a box canyon about 10 miles south of Cimarron. A lazy campfire burned in the center of the camp, and the 5 men sprawled around it with the confidence of wolves who'd never encountered hunters. Sarah's mother sat tied to a tree at the edge of the firelight, her face bruised but defiant. 5 against 2, Catherine whispered from their vantage point on the canyon rim. Not good odds. Better than the odds that woman has if we don't act, Jacob replied. He studied the camp layout, noting where the horses were picketed, where weapons lay within reach, which men looked alert, and which were already drunk on stolen whiskey. We hit them fast and hard, he continued. I'll go in from the right, draw their attention. You circle around and free the woman. Get her to the horses. If shooting starts, don't hesitate. These men gave up their right to mercy when they murdered Henderson and his guard. Catherine nodded, her face set in determined lines. 20 years guarding a cursed mine had prepared her for this in ways Jacob was only beginning to understand. This woman had watched 12 people die and somehow survived. 5 bandits didn't scare her anymore. Nothing could scare someone who'd already faced the worst the West offered. They split up, Catherine circling wide while Jacob climbed down into the canyon through a crack in the rocks. His approach was silent, years of prospecting having taught him how to move through rough terrain without sound. He made it to within 30 yards of the camp before one of the bandits stood to relieve himself, turning in Jacob's direction. Their eyes met across the darkness. The bandit's hand went for his gun. Jacob was faster. His revolver barked once, twice, and the bandit dropped, dead before he hit the ground. The camp exploded into chaos. The other 4 men grabbed for weapons, rolling away from the firelight, shouting curses and questions. Jacob kept moving, not giving them a stationary target, his revolver spitting fire as he advanced. One bandit screamed and went down clutching his shoulder. Another fired wild, his bullet ricocheting off the canyon wall somewhere behind Jacob. Then Catherine's shotgun roared from the other side of camp, both barrels at once, and another bandit folded like paper. She'd emerged from the darkness like vengeance itself, already moving towards Sarah's mother before the echo faded. 2 bandits left. They'd found cover behind their saddles and were returning fire now, more accurately, forcing Jacob to dive behind a boulder as bullets chipped stone near his head. He reloaded quickly, counting rounds, calculating angles. Then he heard Catherine scream, not in pain but in warning. Jacob looked up in time to see one of the remaining bandits charging toward her and the freed captive, knife in hand, murder in his eyes. Jacob's shot took him in the chest. The bandit staggered, looked down at the red bloom spreading across his shirt, then collapsed face first into the dirt. The last bandit saw which way the wind was blowing. He broke from cover and ran for the horses, intending to flee into the night. But Sarah's mother, freed from her bonds, picked up the fallen bandit's rifle and fired. The shot was wild, poorly aimed, but lucky. It caught the fleeing man in the leg, sending him sprawling. Jacob reached him in seconds, his revolver pressed to the back of the man's head. "Give me one reason not to pull this trigger," Jacob said coldly. The bandit whimpered but said nothing coherent. Jacob realized the man was young, maybe 20, with a face that might have been handsome before fear twisted it into something ugly. Just another desperate soul who'd chosen the wrong path in a land that offered too many wrong paths and too few right ones. "Jacob," Catherine called softly. "Let him live." Jacob looked up, surprised. Catherine stood with Sarah's mother, both of them battered but alive, both of them watching him with eyes that had seen too much death already. "He doesn't deserve mercy," Jacob said, though his finger eased slightly on the trigger. "Maybe not," Catherine agreed, "but we do. We deserve to leave this place without more blood on our hands than necessary. We deserve to reach Cimarron as people building something new, not killers carrying fresh corpses." Jacob held the position for a moment longer, the weight of the revolver suddenly unbearable in his hand. Then he stepped back, holstering the weapon. The young bandit scrambled away on hands and knees, bleeding and crying, disappearing into the canyon darkness. "He'll probably die out there anyway," Jacob said. "Probably," Catherine agreed, "but it won't be by our hand." They gathered the camp supplies, weapons, food, money stolen from the stagecoach, and packed it onto the bandits' horses. Sarah's mother, whose name was Margaret Hayes, hugged them both with tears streaming down her face, thanking them over and over until the words became meaningless sounds of gratitude. They rode through the night, wanting distance from the canyon and its dead before they stopped. When dawn broke, they were within sight of Cimarron, a real town with real law, with a future that didn't involve chasing silver or running from curses. At the edge of town, Jacob and Catherine paused, looking at each other across their horses. "Thomas would have been proud," Catherine said quietly, "of both of us." "I didn't do this for Thomas," Jacob replied. "I did it because it was right, because maybe that's worth more than any silver claim." Catherine smiled, the first real, unguarded smile he'd seen from her. "Maybe it is." They rode into Cimarron side by side, 2 people who'd lost everything and found something better in the wreckage. The West had tried to break them, had thrown violence and greed and curses at them until most people would have crumbled. But Jacob Mercer and Catherine Brennan had survived, not by becoming harder, but by remembering how to be human. Behind them, the Copper Mountains rose against the morning sky, still holding their secrets, still guarding their cursed silver. 12 graves stood silent in a hidden valley, testament to the price of greed. But two people who should have been graves 13 and 14 rode on, choosing life over fortune, redemption over revenge. In Cimarron, Catherine found her position teaching school. Jacob took work as a freighter, hauling supplies to remote settlements. They built something small but real, not the fortune Thomas had dreamed of, but something that lasted longer than silver ever could. And every night, when Jacob laid down to sleep in a real bed in a real town, he thought of Thomas buried in that distant canyon. He thought of the promise he'd made to finish what they started. In the end, he'd kept that promise, just not in the way either of them expected. Some debts, Jacob learned, are paid in life, not death. And sometimes the greatest fortune isn't what you find in the ground, but who you find walking beside you on the long road home. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.